The label control is used to display text to users. And whatever you enter into the text property at design time is what shows up in the label at runtime. What are the types of things you might want to do with the label? Well, you might want to change the appearance of a label. And to do that, you can use the auto size property, which controls whether or not the label automatically sizes. So if you enter more text than would fit into the label by default, setting the auto size property true will make the label resize. That saves you some work at design time. You can also use the border style property to control whether or not the label has a border around it. You might want to show and hide a label at runtime. There are a couple of ways you can do this. You can use the visible property. If you set it to true, the label is visible. If you set it to false, the label is not visible. That's pretty straightforward. You can also use the hide and show methods of the label, because calling hide automatically sets the visible property to false. You might want to display an image and text at the same time in a label. You can do this by using the image property to specify the image that you want to display, and then also using the text property to specify the text you want displayed. And then again using the auto size property to have the label resized to show both the image and the text. And you might want to use a label to display help text at runtime. And maybe you don't want the form to show up with the help text already there. You want this to be more contextual. Well, to do that, you can use certain events on the label to determine what the users have done. So for example, you can use the click or the double click events to have help text appear when the user clicks or double clicks on a label. You can also use the mouse enter, mouse hover, and mouse leave events to have text appear when the user moves the mouse over the label. Let's go see a demo and see how to use these techniques with a label. I have Visual Studio open and I have the Common Windows Forms Controls project open. And the first form we want to look at is the Label Text Box Form. And this form has some examples of labels and text boxes. So you have a couple labels on here. This label here, which is the international label, has its border style property. Let me just get the properties window up. Has the border style set to fixed single. I have three choices here: none, fixed single, and fixed 3D. So the international label has a single border around it. The customer ID's border style is set to fixed 3D, so it has that sunken effect. Down at the bottom we have a label, and that's called current date label. That's going to display the date. And there's another label on here. It's hidden. Well, it's sort of hidden. Right here I can see it when the cursor shape changes, and that's the help label. And the reason you can't see anything is because the text property is empty. So the label is actually visible, but it has no text. So you could have text in there and use the visible property to have the label appear or disappear. Here I've chosen to have the label always visible, but to start out with empty text. The only downside to that is it sometimes makes it a little bit harder to find at design time, but if I'm having trouble finding it, I can always just come into the list here and select Help Label. Okay, let's run this form and see what the labels are doing. So I'll choose Label and Text Box Controls and bring that form up. And it retrieves all of the customers from the customers table in the Northwind database. And as I scroll from customer to customer, I can see the customer ID changing. If the customer is not in the US, then this label at the top shows this customer is international. When I get to a US customer, that goes away. You can see at the bottom that it's displaying the date. So let's go see in the code how these things happen. So let me view code on this. I don't need these windows. There we go. So when the form loads, this code's going to run. This first line of code retrieves the information from the customer's table from the Northwind database on SQL Server, and we see how to do that elsewhere in this course. And then after that, the text property of the current date label control is set to display today's date. And I use datetime.today.toString and then pass a capital D, and the capital D causes the date to be displayed in long date format. As we scroll from record to record, this code runs. If the country is not USA, then the international label's visible property is set to true, so it shows up. Otherwise, meaning the country is the US, then the international label is hidden. So in this code, we're using the visible property and setting it to true or false. We could do the same thing by calling the show method of the label and then calling the hide method to hide it. Okay, let's go back to the form. We can also use labels to display help to the user. So if I click in the phone fax text box, then I see some text here, which tells me for this country, Brazil, to use the correct phone format for that country. But if I scroll over to a US company and click in phone or fax, then I get some different text. And that code is up here. The enter event of the text box occurs when that text box gets the focus by my either tabbing into it or clicking in it. And then if the country is the USA, then I set the help label text to this. Otherwise, I set it to the second option. And then when I leave that text box, I empty out the help label. So if I now click off this, the help label doesn't display because there's no text there. There are a couple of other ways in this form that I'm displaying help text. For region, if I click on that, then I'm showing some help text and saying that in the US, by region we mean state. In Canada, by region we mean province. Everywhere else, by region we mean region. And then for the postal code, as I hover over that and leave the mouse over that label, then I see some help text. And then when I move the mouse off, the help text goes back to what it was. So hover over, I get text. Hover off, it's set back. And that's done here. So for the region, when I click on it, I want to display some text. I'm just going to include this text in the click event handler for that label. And for the mouse hovering, I'm going to use actually 3 events: the mouse enter, the mouse hover, and the mouse leave. The mouse enter event happens as soon as I move the mouse onto that label. And what I'm going to do then is store the current help label text to a variable called help label text. And then when the user leaves the mouse hovering over that postal code label, I'll set the help label's text property to postal code means zip code in the US. And then when the user moves the mouse off that label, the mouse leave event occurs, and then I'm going to set the help label text back to what it was. So as I move the mouse over the label, the first thing that happens is I store the current help label text. Then if the user hovers the mouse, I change the help label text. And as soon as the user moves the mouse off that postal code label, set the help label text back. The last thing I want to look at with labels is how I can get both an image and a label. So this right here is a single label. Let's see how we do that. I'm going to close this form and create a new Windows form in this project. And I'll just call it practice. And now what I'm going to do on this, from the toolbox, is drag a label onto this form. And I'm going to set the text to developing applications with Visual Studio 2008. Now the auto size property of this label is set to true, so the label expands to display all of that text. Well, the next thing I want to do is add an image to this. So I'll come down to the image property, which is here, and I'll click the ellipsis next to that, and that brings up the Select Resource dialog. And for our purposes here, we're looking for resources that are images. If the project already has images that are resources, then I can select one of those. Otherwise, I can get a different one and bring that in. To do that, I'd click Local Resource and then click Import, and then go to the folder that contains the images and select an image. So let's pick this one. I bring that in, and now when I click OK, the label has that image, but it doesn't display. So what I would now do is set auto size to false and manually resize this label. And then finally, I'll come down to the text align and put the text in the middle on the bottom. Resize it a little bit again. And now I have a label that has both an image and text. So what you've seen in this demo are some techniques you can use with labels to do things other than just display static text. The text box control is used to get input from users as well as to display text. Now, if you just want to display text, you can use a label or a text box, but if you want the users to be able to enter things by typing, that's what you use a text box for. The text property of the text box control determines as well as controls what text is in there. If you want to know how much text is in the text box, you can use the text length property. You can use the focus method to move the cursor into the text box. And then you can use the cut, copy, paste, and undo methods of the text box to work with the text that's in the text box. Well, what if you want a multi-line text box? Well, you can do that by setting properties. You can set the multi-line property to true. Then you'd probably want to increase the height of the text box, either by setting the height property or just by dragging it. You may want scroll bars. You can set the scroll bars property to vertical to be able to scroll up and down through the text. Set the word wrap property to true if you want words to be wrapped. And then if you want the user to be able to tab inside the text box, set the accepts tab property to true. And if you want the user to be able to hit a carriage return, then set the accepts return property to true. You might want to highlight a text box when the user moves into it. That way the user always knows which text box is current. So to do that, you can use the enter event handler, and the enter event occurs when the cursor or the focus enters the text box. So you could change the back color property of the text box and then set it back when the user exits that text box and trap that with the leave event handler. The user can select text in a text box. You might want to either select text or work with the text that's been selected at runtime. So to do that, the first thing you need to be able to know is what text was selected. Well, the selection start property represents the first character that was selected, and then selection length will tell you the number of characters that were selected. Or you can just use selected text, which represents all of the text that was selected. If you want to do the selecting yourself, you can use the select all method to select everything in the text box. You can use the select method if you only want some of the text selected, and to unselect the text, you can use the deselect all method. You can add auto-completion to a text box. And this is a nice technique to have in Windows applications as well as web applications. So the text box will be monitoring what's been entered, and then it's going to suggest entries based on what's been typed. And you'll use the autocomplete mode property to control how the suggestions are made. You can just add the remainder of the likely value to what the user entered. You can also display all of the likely values in a drop-down list, and you can do both. You can not only add what is probably what the user entered, as well as display it. Now, where do these likely values come from? That's what the autocomplete source property is. So if it's a list that you pulled from a database or a list that you make up on the fly, you'll use the autocomplete source property to have the text box know what values to display. Well, let's go see a demo of using these techniques in a form. Now, the first thing we want to see is that as we scroll from customer to customer, the focus always goes to the company name. Regardless of where the cursor was, when we go to the next customer, the company name gets the focus. Let's go back into the code and see how that happens. And that's going to happen right here. In the code that runs when we move from customer to customer, we call company name text box dot focus, and that's going to move the cursor to the company name text box. If we move into the contact name, notice that it gets selected, and as we move out, it goes back to the way it was. Let's go see the code that makes that happen. Now I can scroll down through here and try to remember where that code was, but actually what's a little bit easier is to select that from here. And so that's going to be in the contact name text box enter and leave events. The enter event occurs when I move into the text box, and so what I want to do there is store what the current back color is. I could use a variable, but here I'm using the tag property of the text box. And if I wanted to do this for every text box, then the tag would be a little bit easier than creating another variable for every text box. So I'm going to store to the tag property the current back color, then I'm going to change the back color to yellow. And then when I exit the text box, the leave event occurs, and in the leave event handler, I'm going to set the back color back to what it was. Now the tag property is an object, so I can't set the color to an object, so I'll take whatever's in tag, cast it to a color, and then set the back color to that. Okay, let's look at a couple other things. When I click in the country text box and then click out, I'm going to convert whatever's in there to uppercase. And I also want to limit what the user enters into the notes text box to no more than 100 characters. So let's see how both of those were done. In the leave event handler of the country text box, I'm just going to convert the text to whatever's in there to uppercase. And then in the leave for the notes text box, I'm going to use the text length property to tell me how many characters were entered. If it's greater than 100, then I'm going to show a message box that says how many characters you have, please keep it under 100. Now in this case I'm not going to prevent the user from doing that. This is really more of a suggestion. Now I'm not limiting the user to entering only 100 characters in the notes, but I am limiting the user in this form from entering more than 15 characters in the city text box. So let's say I enter City of Stockholm here. When I try to leave, I get a message that tells me the city field can only be 15 characters, and I'm not allowed to leave that until I set it back, which I can do by Control-Zing. And now I can move off. Okay, let's see how that's done. Let's go look at the city text box validating. The leave event occurs when I leave the text box. The validating event occurs when I try to leave the text box. And so the validating event has to return true if I'm going to be allowed to leave. And if it returns false, then I can't leave. So if the text length is greater than 15, then I'm going to display a message. And then I'm going to use E. E is the second argument passed to this, and it's an instance of the cancel event args class. And the nice thing about the cancel event args class is that it has a cancel property. And if you set that property to true, then the event that triggered this is disallowed. So it's false by default, but if the user entered more than 15 characters, cancel is true, and I'm not allowed to leave that field until I enter no more than 15 characters. Okay, let's go back to the form, and I want to copy this text, so I'm going to select this text. I'll select copy here, and then I want to paste it into the notes. Now how did I know what was selected, and how did I actually get that text to appear in the notes text box? Let's go look at the copy toolstrip menu item. There's a copy, there's a cut, there's a paste. So this code runs when I select edit copy on the menu. And what I want to do is copy the text. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because how do I know that the current control is actually a text box? So the first thing I do is I use the active control property of the form to see if we're currently on a text box. So if this .ActiveControl is text box, then we'll copy text if there was selected text. Well, this .ActiveControl is an object, so I cast it to a text box, and then I use the selection length property, which tells me the length of text that was selected. If that's greater than 0, then I'm going to copy the contents of that text box. The cut works similarly. It's going to cut the contents of the text box, and then the paste says if I'm trying to paste into a text box, then I will issue the paste method, and that puts into that text box whatever's in the clipboard. All right, the last thing I want to look at for text boxes is auto-completion. So I'm going to shut this down and bring back the practice form that we created in the previous demo. Let's move this over there. And then let's add a text box to this form. Right there. And what I want to do is create a text box where the user can enter states, and the text box will understand what the list of states is and autocomplete. So the first thing I'm going to do in this text box, I'm going to get the properties window up so it's a little more visible, is I'm going to set the autocomplete mode property to append. If I choose suggest, then the text box will display in a drop-down list the possible values based on what I entered. If I choose append, then it will automatically fill out the text box. So I'm going to choose append. Then I'm going to set autocomplete source to custom source. There are a number of other options here, but I want to create the list of things that the text box is using. And I'll do that in the autocomplete custom source property. I'll click the ellipsis here, and then I can enter the probable values. And those are going to be states. So we'll do Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and California. And I'll click OK. Okay, and then the last thing I need to do is make sure that this form appears when I run this. So I'll just go into Program and tell it when I run the application, start the practice form, not the switchboard. Okay, now we'll run this. Here's my practice form, and when I type W, because there's only one state that starts with W, the form automatically completes that. Now if I come back in here and I set this from append to suggest, now when I run this and I type a W, the list of likely values appears in a drop-down list. So what you've seen in this demo are techniques you can use with text boxes to help the users enter information on forms. So we've looked at label and text box. The third of the controls you're going to use over and over again on every single form is the button. And the button control is the primary way that users cause actions to occur. And after you set the text of the button, the place you're going to write a lot of code is the click event. The click event occurs when the user selects the button. So you'll put into the click event handler the code you want to execute when the user clicks the button. Now there are things you can do with the button. For example, you might want to control whether users can click a button. You can set the enabled property to true or false. So you might disable a button until some condition is met and then enable it. So you can enable and disable buttons. To save screen real estate, you might use a single button for multiple purposes and then just change the text. So in the demo, we'll see a form that has an add button and a cancel button. You'll click add when you want to add a record, and then disable the add button because you're in the middle of currently adding, and then you would enable the cancel button. And then if you clicked the cancel button, then you would disable that and enable the add button. Now if you have screen real estate issues, you could just use a single button that says Add, and then when you click Add, the button changes to say Cancel. When you click Cancel, the button changes back to say Add. Both of those techniques will work. You can change the appearance of a button, and to do that you can use the Flat Style property. You can set it to Standard, Flat, or Pop-Up to change the way the button looks, and we'll see that shortly. Earlier we saw how to display an image and text at the same time on a label. You can do the same thing with a button. You can use the image or the background image property to specify what image you want to display in the button. Then you can use the image align property to control where the image appears. And if there's also text on the button, you can use the text align property to control where the text appears. Now you'll find yourself in your applications creating a lot of dialog boxes. So for example, the user tries to close a form. You want to pop up a dialog box that says, do you want to save your changes? Yes or no. Or you'll have a dialog box that has OK and cancel buttons. Now of course the user can click on these, but you also want the user to be able to essentially select the yes or OK button or the no or cancel button using the keyboard. And to do that, you can make a button the default or the cancel button. So if you set the form's accept button property to the OK or the yes button, then that will be the default button, and therefore if the user presses enter on the keyboard, that's equivalent to clicking the button. Then you can use the cancel button property of the form to identify which button is the cancel button, the no button, the cancel button. And then if the user presses escape on the keyboard, that's the same as clicking that button. So let's go see how to use these techniques with buttons. I have the common Windows Forms controls sample application running. Let's go look at buttons. I'll click Button Controls, and this brings up the Button Control Demos form. And there's really two things you'll focus on when using buttons. One is controlling the look and feel, and the second is what code runs. So for example, when I click Close, that closes the form. Or when I click this button, that brings the form up. So why is it that when I click Close, the form closes? That's because in the click event handler of the Close button, I've called the close method of the form. Now on a data entry form, you'll typically have add and cancel buttons. And when the user clicks add, I want to make sure that they don't try and add another record, whether it's a customer or an order or whatever. I don't want them to add a second one until they either save or cancel this. So I'm going to disable the add button when the user clicks it. And then if the user clicks cancel, or it could be save, then I'm going to re-enable the button. So in the click event handler of the add button, I'll set its enabled property to false. And then when the user clicks the cancel button, I'll set the enabled property of the add button to true. So that's going to enable and disable the control based on what's happening on the form. Now sometimes real estate will be at a premium on a form, and you don't really have room for both an add and a cancel button. So in this case, you can have this single button do double duty. When I click add, it's now the cancel button. When I click cancel, it's now the add button. And to do that, I'm just going to change the text property. So when the button is clicked, if the text is currently add, then the user has clicked the add button, and in addition to running code to add whatever needs to be added, I'm going to set the text property for that button to cancel. Next time the user clicks that button, it's the cancel button. I'll set the text property back to add, and then do whatever needs to be done to cancel. This form has 4 buttons that show the 4 different flat styles, and the flat style controls how the button looks when you not only hover over it, but click it. There are 4 choices. Standard. If you set the flat style to standard, then the control appears 3-dimensional, and when you click it, it looks like you're clicking in. If you set the flat style to system, then the appearance of the control is determined by the operating system. And in this case, the operating system makes a system button look like a standard button. If you set flat style to flat, then the button appears flat. It's highlighted when you hover over it, and then clicking, the button doesn't appear to move because it's flat. And finally, if you set flat style to pop up, then the button now appears three-dimensional when you hover over it, and then appears to be going in when you click it, just like the other three-dimensional buttons. And the flat style is a property of the button. Let's go find our properties. Here we are. And the flat style can be any of these four. These two buttons on the form have images. If I click the More Information button, I can get more information on AppDev. If I click the Help button, I can get help. And I did the images a couple different ways on these two buttons. On this button, I didn't use the image property of the button. I used the background image property, which I set to the AppDev logo. And then I used the background image layout property. I set that to stretch to cause the image to resize, to cause the image to fill out the button. And then I also have text on here, so I have the text property set to more information, and then text align set to bottom center, so that text would appear on the bottom. On the second button, the Help button, I have no text at all. And what I did was I set the image property to the question mark image, and because it's a fairly small image, I then resized the button to make it smaller. Now if I click Save, a form pops up. This dialog is actually a form. And it asks me, do you want to save this file? If I want to save the file, I can click Yes. Or I can also press Enter. And if I don't want to save the file, I can either click No or press Escape. And this dialog is actually a form. It's the Confirm Save dialog form. It has two buttons, the Yes button and the No button. And at the form level, I've set the Accept button property to the Yes button and the Cancel button property to the No button. So now when this form comes up as a dialog, I can press Enter or Escape, as well as click the Yes or No buttons. So what you've seen in this demo are some techniques you can use to control how buttons look and behave in applications. And aside from what you'll do image-wise, the majority of the work you'll do in buttons, of course, is writing code that runs when the button's clicked.